Evening, Matt.
Hey Graham, how you doing? Good to see you.
I'm all right, thanks. Welcome to the Crazy in Love podcast, where two therapists talk about all things modern relationships. Tonight, Matt, we are talking about something that has really caught the interest of the Instagram and TikTok generation. A lot of 20 somethings talking about attachment theory these
Yeah.
days. So tonight we're going to do a bit of a deep dive on attachment theory, but particularly kind of our views on where we see attachment styles and attachment theory as being relevant to our work with individuals and couples. Talk to us to begin with about attachment theory, and then maybe we should let listeners know about our personal history with attachment theory and some of the organizations who are its proponents.
Yeah, there's a long version of this, isn't there, which everybody will be pleased to
Keep it
know.
short. Keep it short.
When we were just swapping a text on this, I offered our one sentence definition of something like this. I'm just going to read back from our text exchange. So I think we've said something like attachment theory says that your earliest relationships, and that's usually those with your mum and or dad in most circumstances, set the template for every relationship you later form, meaning that you kind of carry that childhood blueprint, that sort of template into how you relate to people today. That's sort of it in a nutshell. It really speaks to how you trust and love others, how needy you are, how independent you are. It influences all that stuff in the present. And I think that's quite a big, bold statement to make. And I think you want to critique some of that. And I think I want to hold on to some of that as, I don't know about true, but useful,
I think the bit, yeah, I think the bit that I want to critique is not necessarily the bones of attachment theory, which I think stands the test of time, and there's a lot of empirical evidence to back up the core of what you were just talking about. What I want to maybe critique as we go through this conversation is how it has become a kind of synonym or a description for what I think are actually broader descriptions of psychology, personality, emotional development beyond what the originators of attachment theory meant.
So it gets a bit fixed, doesn't it? I think is that what you're saying? It feels like any categorization. So they're broadly like three or four attachment styles, aren't there? So if you're really lucky and you had a good start in life, you'll be secure. You'll be able to relate to people, deal with them disappointing you sometimes. If they behave really poorly to you, you'll recognize that as poor treatment and you'll exit the relationship at an early point. And then you might be more avoidant of attaching deeply to people. You might be wary of that. And then you might have a more anxious style at the other side of the continuum. Secure is somewhere in the middle. There's also usually a disorganized style, and we can come to that if you think it's worth it. But that's sort of crudely how it breaks down. And that just, I guess, any chunking of something as complex as human nature into three or four categories or buckets or swim lanes or whatever we call them is inevitably going to feel fairly crude.
Yeah,
But
let's but before we critique the theory, I think we need to do two things. One, again, is to kind of talk about very briefly our personal history with it, just to lay those cards on the table, but then talk about how we've either found it useful in our own lives and relationships or in the clinical work that we do. Because I think both of us would agree that attachment theory as a metaphor, as a frame, can be enormously
yeah,
useful, right? With clients, particularly with couples as well. But let's
yeah,
why don't we talk just a little bit? Why don't you kind of talk about your history of the Bowlby Centre and just make sure that people who are listening know that we've got that history with it with the
yeah.
theory.
I mean, it might be more interesting to talk about yours first because I think yours predates mine. But I think when I was thinking about originally training, the Bowlby Centre like drew me in because Bowlby is a key figure in
Yeah.
psychology and psychotherapy more generally, and is the figure most obviously associated with attachment theory. The Bowlby Centre is one of the maybe the only place in the UK that really has any kind of deep specialism in that area. Like that's their take, that's their stance, that's the lens through which they see the world. And I think if you were picking certainly psychotherapy trainings, probably you and I both felt that that was closest to what feels true about the world. If you were going to be a bit reductive about it and you had to throw your lot in with anyone, for me, it felt like he's a sensible guy. This is based on some empirical studies, you know, and he's not the only one. This is not guru land. This is not like somebody who's spun out a wild kind of theory of thinking. This is basically based on animal experimentation in its earliest form, right?
Yeah, exactly. So two things really appealed to me about attachment theory when I decided to train at the Bowlby Centre. One was that it was based in scientific evidence. It had a lot of empirical evidence behind it. And the people involved in attachment seemed to be people that took a scientific approach, including being willing to accept studies that falsify the theory to certain degrees. And I like that a lot. The other is that it's based in the real world, right? And I don't think we should underestimate how revolutionary it was in the mid 20th century for someone to be saying in the realm of psychology, the real world matters. Real relationships with primary caregivers influence your personality and how you feel later in life, rather than it all being a kind of Freudian intrapsychic
Yeah.
realm of the mind. And I think that feels common sense today, but it didn't feel common sense in 1950s psychology.
No, my journey into this, we were talking a tiny bit of that, weren't we, before we pressed record. My journey into this is through the criminal justice system, through working in prisons and probation. And that is where I saw that kind of thing. I see it in my own life as well, and the lives of the people around me. But what you see in prison, the young men who ended up in Feltham Young Offenders Institution, which I think was a largest young offender institution in Europe at the time, they had what you would call really horrible, awful, difficult, neglectful, sometimes abusive starts in life. I could probably find you a case where that didn't look like it were so, but that is the lion's share of the kids in Feltham, right? Very few kids in Feltham have grown up with a mum and a dad who love one another, love the bones of the child, and provide materially for that child and set an example by going out to work and grinding out difficult things and problem solving together in a calm and harmonious way.
Yeah, good. Before we talk about the positives of attachment theory, let's just kind of almost say what this discussion is not going to be. We're not going to go through the empirical evidence for and against attachment theory, really, are we? We're going to just raise how we've used it clinically and maybe some limitations to it, sometimes based in the evidence, but we're not going to walk listeners through study after study. I don't think that would be interesting or particularly exciting for them.
No, and we should maybe locate ourselves in that, just to finish that story off with the
Yeah.
Bowlby. I was the chair there for a while, a few years back, and you were the policy director, and you, I think, did some teaching there as well. So I mean, I guess we were, given that it's a relatively small outfit, you were the policy director and I was the chair. We were really quite heavily involved in it, and I think we've got a more distant stance from it now, a little bit more. I don't know what you'd say, skeptical, but a little bit more like that's not my only. That's not how I would see the entirety of my identity as a professional, as somebody working in psychological services or delivering psychotherapy or counseling or mental health support to people.
I agree. I used to call myself an attachment-based therapist, right? Because I used to see the world of mental health through that lens. I think coming on to one of the criticisms we'll talk about later on is the idea that I don't think there is any one lens through which you should see mental health and personality development. I think lots of things contribute to the makeup of a complex individual, and trying to see, for example, bipolar disorder and problems with relationships and depression and anxiety all through the lens of attachment seems to me to be quite reductive. So I don't call myself an attachment-based therapist for that reason.
It's maybe too easy an example, but I think also the sort of neuro diverse overlay that is much more apparent now than it was when I initially trained. It also complicates that picture. Like, I see a lot of people now who are willing to think of themselves in those terms, have sometimes been diagnosed formally, sometimes less formally, not always helpfully when that's the case, but like who are in touch with that thing, and how you make sense of that, I think, is a big part of it, isn't it? And I mean, as two family men, your kids pop out differently. Like, we're doing broadly the same thing, and you would identify in one child a very different set of traits than you would identify in another, right? So there is a big genetic something going on, isn't there? There is a big kind of biological, you see that child almost from birth with a set of traits. I think you could get into arguing whether you respond to them because you see, but I think they honestly just feel instinctively different. To most parents who've got two kids would say, oh my gosh, you can't believe how,
100%. And there's a complex interplay there, isn't there, in terms of how you as a parent respond differently. So one of the ideas behind attachment theory that I find a little bit difficult around the edges is this idea that, for example, the anxious attachment style is supposedly based on inconsistent parenting.
yeah.
I think all of us are inconsistent parents. There's obviously a degree to which we're talking about inconsistency, of course, and that's maybe what we can come on to in a bit more detail, is what do some of these labels and definitions really mean? Because I've got 3 kids, they're all different. I'm a different parent with all of them. I'm a different parent if I'm tired. I'm a different parent if I'm stressed, right? If I'm an inconsistent parent, does that mean my kids are going to come out with anxious attachment styles? Probably, well, hopefully not, but
No,
no.
and I think that is what I think that takes you into something, because I think sometimes that is the criticism or the charge, and I think there is a touch of the straw man to that argument. It's not
Yeah,
a
interesting.
whether you're tired sometimes, or whether sometimes you will or you won't allow them additional screen time. When this goes wrong in families, when this goes wrong and it starts to feel like neglect or an adverse childhood experience, those are really serious things that repeat and repeat and repeat. So if you were saying in that example, so I am aggressive and I shout at them every day,
Yeah.
and very often I will break something in the kitchen, or I will damage some item of theirs that means very much to them. Well, there is a pattern of you behaving in an uncontrollable and scary way, and that would lead you somewhere else. But you occasionally being snappy with them and saying, I have already told you to put your shoes on, please. That would be something
I don't go that far, Matt, for heaven's sake.
quite different.
No, I think that's really helpful. I was deliberately creating a bit of a straw man for us to go into it there. We're really the insecure attachment styles. So you've, in effect, although you talked about 3 or 4, you've got your secure styles or your insecure styles. And the insecure styles, which we can maybe segue into now, are fundamentally originated when something goes quite wrong, as you were
Yeah.
talking about, right? So maybe bring us into that world and how you find it useful with clients and couples in your clinical work.
Yeah, so I mean, let me have a go at doing that. And I think that your question back might be, well, that isn't quite particular to attachment theory. So I was just going to say the example we were kicking about beforehand was somebody with, I don't know, let's say health anxieties, or it could be any form of anxiety. It could be generalized social anxiety. It tends to come from somewhere, I think, and it tends to come from that start in life. Usually there is a parent or there are a set of circumstances that have attuned that young person to anxiety, that the world around them is anxious. Somebody else is concerned about food going out of date, or air travel, or heights, or being on the underground, or being overwhelmed by something, or financial pressures, or whatever it might be. And rather than stepping through those things and dealing with them in a calm way, which is not to say overcoming them in every respect, you wouldn't be able to overcome financial pressures by being calm about them, but how you talk about them and how you model that, and what adult conversations they witness around those things, I think have a massive bearing on how they cope with those things. So another example would be kids' sports, and what I see on the sidelines as a parent very often is parents charging on if the kid gets a ball in the face or gets tripped up. And you're not meant to, those are not the rules. The coach is allowed on if it's a head injury, and that's pretty much the deal. But most people can't hold themselves back, or lots of people can't hold themselves back from doing that. And to my mind, it is a somewhat anxious reaction. Isolated to a ball in the face on a football field, it's neither here nor there. But if that is every instance of slips or trips or poor marks or falling out with friends, if there is an anxious parent hovering, very worried about it, going 10 to the dozen, fixing things up, showing you that stuff is like very, very difficult or very, very upsetting or very worrisome, I think you will probably pick up the vibe from that.
I think you're right that I want to tease out the attachment part of what you're talking about, because I think you're talking more about the origins of a general and maybe a specified anxiety in life more generally.
But I think it
I want
pervades.
to narrow us down in those examples about like how that would manifest in romantic relationships. Part of the reason I'm pushing is that I have seen and continue to see some clients who I would say their anxiety really is quite manifest only in romantic relationships, right? They feel confident at work, they've got plenty of friends, they feel good about themselves, but as soon as they get into a vulnerable romantic relationship, that's when the anxiety really kicks in for them.
Yeah, I think it's a great example. I would wonder how settled, calm, at ease, harmonious they
Yeah,
are in
good,
those other
good.
domains. I
I
think it's
agree.
showing
I
up in
agree.
sharp relief in one area, and I suspect there is some residue of that elsewhere. So when the career falters, in my mind, I had someone young, in mind as you were speaking. And so often it's unbroken progress, isn't it? You join something, the kind of people you and I see have probably done pretty well at university and done all that academic good stuff. And you get to about sort of 28, 29, still going really well. And then you're not on partner track, or, something happens, or somebody else elbows you out of the way, or you screw something up, or, you get restructured. I think those are the key moments. And I think what happens in romantic relationships is you get a lot of those key moments. You get a lot of those tests of character. Well, how is it to be dumped out of nowhere? How is it to be cheated on? How is it to find out, then deal with those things? And I guess for me, romantic relationships are not a different entity necessarily. They are giving you a very sharp test. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I think the stakes are higher, aren't they? So
They
the anxiety just becomes that much bigger. The sense of, yeah, I don't want to get too over the top with it, but the sense of psychic death that can really kind of
Yeah,
can feel on the edge of the end of a relationship. I think for some people it really can feel like that. It can feel like their world is ending, and almost they are ending as an individual when their relationship
yeah,
ends.
I agree. That wouldn't have been the language I used, but I quite like it. It is very personal, is what I would have said about it. Whereas at work, it's like, well, they are restructuring, and like we do need to save headcount. So yeah, you can take a much more pragmatic view of that. And also somebody else who you think was good at their job is in a similar position to you. So sometimes it can feel less stingy, it can feel just a bit removed from you, right? And you also know that if you're a really good lawyer, you can take your really good lawyering skills somewhere else, and it might not have been what you wanted, and it might be a bit of humiliation for you in the short term. It might be tough to tell friends when you'd told them you were really happy at work and you thought good things were happening, but it's not quite the end of the world. Whereas, splitting up with somebody who you've set up home with and they know all your friends, you know all theirs, and you've got to separate that, it really hurts, huh? Really
Yeah,
bites. Really
absolutely. Absolutely. I think where I've found this most transformational in the work I do, particularly with couples, is helping them understand their differences from that perspective. So they might come to me complaining about each other's personalities and the way they respond to certain situations, but really understanding that it's not just a quirk of their personality that they're behaving in this way. It's something fundamentally deep and ingrained in how they
yeah,
respond to stressful situations in relationships. So the more
yeah,
avoidant person might go inwards and move away from their romantic partner, and that can be incredibly difficult for the more anxious person in the partner or a relatively secure person to deal with. And understanding that that's based on some pretty profoundly important childhood experiences, that someone's not just being an asshole through
yeah.
a different lens, it's something really quite vulnerable that they're expressing in those moments. I think that can be really, really helpful and transformative for couples to
I
understand.
agree. I agree. Yeah, I agree. And to build on that, I think when you see individuals, part of it for me, one of the favorite sort of therapy films I really like. Sometimes it's criticized as a bit sentimental, but the scene from Good Will Hunting, where it says to him, "It's not your fault," still gives me chills when I occasionally go to that and find it on YouTube. It was a really powerful moment in the film, and a powerful sort of moment in my life when I'm like, it wasn't, it really wasn't my fault. That you might know that intellectually, as he does in the film. He's a very smart guy. He knows a lot of things intellectually, but to really feel like this wasn't him, this wasn't anything that he did. He's not so much wrongly wired as has had a kind of start which has predisposed him towards some things and given him a tendency and a pull and a draw, and creates real vulnerabilities when you start to think about getting close to somebody. That I think is quite powerful in individual work as well, that like this is true for you, but it doesn't necessarily mean that this is your fault. What it means for me as the next step is you have got to take responsibility for it. I'm afraid it's bad luck, right? It is bad.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about that, because one of the issues I see with the kind of categorization of young people of their attachment style is almost an identity element to
Yeah,
it
sure. Agreed.
that I feel a little bit uncomfortable with, because fundamentally having an insecure attachment style is not very pleasant, firstly, but secondly, you can also change it. The evidence suggests you
Yeah.
can. I think
Yeah.
our clinical work, from my side of things, I think you'd agree, suggests that you can. And mainly people are coming to therapy for change, right? They come into therapy to shift something. And one of the lovely bits about Good Will Hunting and that scene is that it's a cathartic bit of that change, right? It's a really important moment in his shift of focus and his taking some responsibility for himself.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that's the thing, isn't it? I think that's when therapy goes right and wrong. I think it's hard to know what enables somebody to really be at that point, readiness to change, to really want to change more than to want to stay the same. I see quite a few people who want to change a bit and who also want to stay the same a bit. And sometimes the stay the same a bit is bigger than the change a bit,
Yeah.
because there's a cost there, isn't there? And you've done it this way and it's kept you safe. The other thing about attachment theory, which made such a lot of sense to me, is that it is adaptive in the moment. So if you find yourself withdrawing in sort of later life, you probably were withdrawing at an earlier point in your life, and you were probably withdrawing for really sensible reasons. Just checking my camera had frozen there slightly, and apologies for that. Then that at that point in time, it would have been a really smart and sensible thing to do, to get yourself away, to get yourself out of there. Typically, child might go to their bedroom to avoid conflict in the home, to anticipate a parent, turning on them, or to avoid parental conflict or whatever else. They would do those things, or they might do a thing where they, I don't know, try and curry favor with that parent, or charm them, or soothe them, or else it might be, because they know they're good at that, or they can do that. So I think the things that made sense back in the day no longer help you in the present.
Yeah, and most of the people I work with, that makes intuitive sense and can be quite a lovely moment of self-recognition and self-compassion as well, something they might beat themselves up about, something that partners might have criticized them for over the years, might have even dumped them because of over the years, becomes something instead that they can understand about themselves as an adaptive response, and then from that point do something about it.
Yeah, where I think it breaks down, I don't know if this is a helpful segue or it takes off the kind of theme or the spine, if we've got a spine for this, so I was talking to somebody recently outside of clinical setting, and they just don't like social occasions, and I'm really sympathetic to that. It's not my favorite thing. My wife is really outgoing and loves meeting new people, and I really don't. So we've sort of arranged our life so that we can somehow meld the best of that together, and I can sometimes leave things early or sometimes opt out of social settings. And I don't know whether that's an attachment theory thing. When I was talking to this person in particular, I'm like, well, you are a quiet guy, you are an introverted guy, and he's really happy to accept that definition. And that bit, that's a really big feature of his life, and it's going to be a really big feature of his life with his partner, and whether or not, for example, they take steps into family life, that feels like a huge decision, how they organize that, what she does, what he does. It's part of that kind of thinking process. And I don't know what attachment theory has to say about that. Not terribly much, I suspect. So I don't know if this is a segue to those sort of big 5 personality traits, but I think attachment theory, if it was, I think attachment theory helps you understand where some of that comes in. But I think the big 5 personality traits open up a wider vista of how you consider what a person is, and what they look like, and what they're good at, and what careers suit them, and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I see them as compatible in the sense that the N in the big 5, the ocean, OC, N. The
Yeah.
N is neuroticism, and I definitely recognize people whose personality styles are quite neurotic in that they're quite anxious, they're overthinkers, they're worriers, they're more prone to depression and anxiety. But I also, like I was saying earlier, I know people who you wouldn't describe as neurotic on that category of the 5 key kind of personality types, but when they're in romantic relationships, have deeply anxious thoughts and behaviors based on a real vulnerability around rejection, for example, that does
Yeah.
seem to exist separate from a generalized anxiety. It seems like you kind of slightly disagree with that. I think they're complementary. I think attachment kind of overlays maybe we're going into a bit too much detail here on some of
I think that's a good.
the language, but I think it's where attachment theory sometimes, on the one hand, seems to be a description of personality in general, which I think is a misnomer. I think it gets it wrong. I don't think that's what attachment is. I think it's enormously helpful when thinking about romantic relationships as an add-on almost, or a kind of more general overlay to the big 5 personality types.
Yeah. I wondered if it was worth like 10 seconds on those.
Yeah, go for it. Go for it.
To call them out. So the OCEAN acronym that you mentioned is, let me see if I can get them right: open, conscientious, extroverted, agreeable, and neurotic. And neurotic is the one that doesn't really stand the test.
10 points for Matt.
It's so judgmental, isn't it, to call someone neurotic or to regard things as
yeah, you just have to think of Woody Allen, don't you, when you use the word neurotic? I mean, it's the obvious go-to point.
Yeah, I think your definition of it was a good one, right? It's moodiness, mood swings, right? Emotional instability and anxiety, right? That would be how you'd understand it.
And generally, people on that end of the spectrum tend to be more unhappy in their lives as well. The evidence suggests.
Yeah. And so I was just going to build, I think, on what you're saying, really, rather than challenge back. So I would say within those personality traits, the kind of client I often see is a guy who is very successful at work, has been often been like successful at work at a later point in their career. So there's no doubt about how successful they are at work. They've made the money, they've achieved some status for themselves, but they've done that. Typically the kind of people I see are in finances or tech, or the midpoint of those two, fintech, if that means anything to anyone. It means something to me now, much more than it did before I started seeing lots of people from that world. And the sort of introverted bit of that often really helps. The bit in terms of attachment theory, the sort of that's not quite avoidant in a word,
No.
but avoidant as in, like, you get on, you consume your own smoke, you take absolute accountability and responsibility for things. You're not there making chit chat, you're deal making, or you're on the numbers, or you are all business. Those kind of people who are very rigid focused. There's a bit of conscientiousness coming in as well. They do really well at work. They're often highly successful people in a bunch of industries. You could go beyond the ones I've mentioned, but it doesn't make them easy to live with, and it doesn't make their relationships very good. So lots and lots of people highly successful at work, got those kind of characteristics, personality traits that I'm talking about. And when they show up in a relationship, they feel avoidant. They don't want to talk about work when they go home. And sometimes the partner, the woman typically, will say, I just want to hear about his day, or he never talks to me about his day. And they're like, I don't want to. I've got nothing to say. I want home to be home. And that is, creates tension. Sorry, that was a lot of words to say something quite simple.
No, I want the bit that I want to tease out is around happiness against unhappiness, right? So the guys that you're talking about wouldn't necessarily say there's anything that they want to change about themselves in relationships necessarily, would they?
I think they might. They would certainly recognize that something was going wrong, and that they were, at its weakest, getting it in the ear, and at its strongest, that they're not really geared up for this. They've not got great points of connection with the kids. They don't find home life easy, and they really enjoy conversation with their partner. Like they're good at handing the baton, some of them really competent parents and are involved, you know, where they're sort of, you know, more progressive by nature, but it's not really, it's more of a handoffs than a we do this together and it's wonderful and we reflect and we bask in like what we're creating together in family life. They're not those kind of guys because they're not really doing that at work. They've done a deal, they're on to the next deal.
And just going back a step, you're pretty confident that the bulk of that, or at least a significant chunk of that personality element, that more avoidant attachment bit, is based on early childhood experiences, as opposed to a kind of temperamental, more genetically based predisposition.
I think that's what I was wondering really, and where that overlap is. I wouldn't say I had a fixed answer to that, but I think quite often when it shows up in the relationship, when it allows somebody to be good at work in like quite particular circumstances. So these are not community builders, you know, these are not people who are doing collaborative work or trying to bring together and bridge. They're usually lone wolves doing things, or they've got highly specialized functions, so they can collaborate with other excellent individuals who also provide, you know, a really high quality output that they need. But it's a transactional set of relationships rather than relationships because it's lovely and it's fun and I really like that person. It's like that person's very good job and they deliver for me. And I think sometimes when you see that at work and then you see that at home, that to me feels more like avoidant, or a bit of avoidant, rather than I am just introverted or I'm just like a quants guy, you know?
Yeah, I agree. Let's talk a little bit about change. And would it be fair to say that changing an attachment style from an insecure one, be it avoidant or anxious, to something more secure is fundamentally about trying to tolerate doing things differently over time and again, to just try and lean into a relationship in a different way? So if you're avoidant, for example, it's about trying to be open to emotional connection with your partner and try and push yourself out of your comfort zone. If you're on the more anxious style, it's about trying to get tolerance for internalizing and regulating more of that difficult emotional stuff rather than bring it into the relationship. Is it that simple?
Yeah, I mean, simple to say and really hard to do.
Indeed.
The instructions for walking a tightrope, very, very simple. One foot in front of the other, maintain.
Nice. Yeah, I like that.
So, I mean, it's that sort of thing. And for me, it is habit change, and it is doing it every day, and not doing it every day because at some point it'll click in and then you'll be fine. It's doing it every day, like you might work a program of recovery and addiction. Like every day you're doing that thing. Or if you were an elite athlete, there is something to do every day, including the rest day. You know, there is a program of activity, and you've got to be super serious about it. The sort of jargony phrase is earned secure, which I quite like because I think you are. And I think it's a bit regrettable. I think it's a shame you had to earn it and it had to go wrong for you. You know, I wish it could have been otherwise, but you are now having to earn it. And any moaning about the quantity or volume of work you've got to put in is somewhat besides the point. You know, up to you. You know, you want to carry on repeating those patterns. I mean, you know, to some extent, be my guest. I'll be sad for you, but you know, going after those things, I think is a heck of a lot of work. And I really, you know, I admire the people who do that. And I think that's the bit of therapy that feels for me that it isn't quite open to techniques and tools, as in you can do it quickly. Techniques and tools for sure. I think you need them. That's where I'd say attachment theory is not quite enough. I would bring in some stuff from acceptance and commitment therapy and from CBT in particular, cognitive behavioral therapy, to give you some way of navigating that terrain. But it's quite a long journey, I think, to understand your style, to understand why you're like that, to make some peace with it, you know, to forgive yourself, to forgive the people around you predisposed you to quite a problematic style. I'm probably thinking of my journey now, you know, and then relationship by relationship, do something about it. For me, it was quite a long, slow journey out of that, rather than like, I get it. Like I've got this little grid and now I know what I need to do differently. And yeah, it was relatively straightforward once I had that.
And is it all right if we stay in your story just for a little bit longer? Because I want to explore that bit of it around whether it genuinely feels different once you've put that work in. So yes, you can get an avoidant person to have more open conversations with their partner pretty easily. That's a tools and techniques question.
Yeah.
Over time, what we're saying is that starts to feel different inside you. You start to joy, for want of a better word, that the connection with your partner? Using your story, would you vouch for that? Use it like it feels different over time if you put the work in.
Yeah, exactly that. And I think you wouldn't maintain it if it didn't, right? Like it just, you need that to build the momentum, to keep doing it, to come back to it. And that is the promise of therapy, the bit that isn't just hard graft. It's like, we really are building, and this feels better and better. And I'm really enjoying this, and I'm seeing the purpose of it. So my story is, I think my one of my sort of serious girlfriend, when I was just starting my career, I was given probably the first time I'd ever given a speech of any significance to any number of people. And she said, a friend of mine, and she said, me and a friend of mine will be in the audience. She said, I'll be in the audience. I'll be there, so don't worry, because I'll be there. And previously I would have been like, that is the very thing I'm trying to avoid. Looking like a fool in front of you is my worst nightmare. Pretty bad in front of these people, pretty bad in front of friends and colleagues, even worse in front of you. Because what I want to be for you is always on it, high performing, super competent, da 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 da. And that wasn't where she was coming out at all. She was like, this is difficult, this is difficult for anyone. And I'm there, and I'm going to be on your side, whether it goes well or badly, cheering me on, so to speak. And it was the first moment where something sort of different clicked for me. Don't know if that makes much sense.
It makes a lot of sense. What happened to her? She sounds great.
Well, and now she's no, she's not. But it was a journey through those things, because at the same time, like, without making this about me, I also would have messed up so many, and did mess up so many other things in that relationship. So I couldn't quite glue it all together. That was a lovely moment, and there were many, many more, but there were also things that I just couldn't catch quickly enough, and would still be, difficult to be around when something like that kind of, I was going to say triggered me. I try and not use that word, but
yeah.
something piqued me, or something was really difficult, or so I think in the end you can still bust relationships and still hurt other people and still be on that sort of slightly slow boat, but going somewhere.
I think that's the bit that we probably haven't said enough about, is the toxic behaviors that come from some of these attachment styles, right? So on the anxious side of things, you're likely to be making your partner feel shitty for being 5 minutes home late from work. You're going to be quite jealous. You might look at their phone surreptitiously at night time because you're worried they're going to cheat on you. You're punishing them implicitly when they go out with their mates. It's that kind of thing we're talking about, which is toxic in a relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And the turning away is really painful as well.
Yes, totally.
And they just hear about your day, and it's not that hard to say it was a heck of a day today, or even to explain that that's not your thing, really.
Yeah, you have plenty of other things you can talk about that I'm sure your partner wouldn't worry that much if you're not talking about work. If you're going to talk about, I don't know, what you want to do at the weekend, or what you want for dinner, or something, just to connect. They just want to connect. They don't really want to know about your day necessarily. They just want to connect with you over something that's important to you.
Yeah, and sometimes the avoidant people will really take flight at the smallest things. I'm thinking about my life and the life of the clients I talk to. The people who are, have that way, that tendency. They'll run. They'll leave. They won't just leave the house for a short while and then come back, or offer a text saying, "Sorry, I think I overreacted there." They'll be gone for days. Or in some instances, they'll move out and they'll take an Airbnb if they've got the resources, and really double down on the need for distance, or the whatever it might be. Whereas what we really need is a phone call to say, I don't quite know what was going on for me. I don't want to blow the relationship up. Can we try and talk? Can we think? Can we, whatever the next steps might be, talk to one together about what's going on? Would be like the ideal scenario, probably in that situation. But they'll go for days, or they'll be mean and punishing in those days as well. So I think that it really predisposes you to some very poor behavior. So it's definitely not your fault. I have every degree of sympathy for people who find themselves in those positions as a sort of consequence of a upbringing which was way off. But also, you wreak havoc in other people's lives when you're acting out those behaviors. And I guess there comes a point where you probably want to get on top of that and take responsibility for those things. It wasn't your fault, but it is your responsibility now to do something about it, and particularly in relationships where other people are intimately involved, and sometimes a new generation of children are involved. That feels like a very powerful incentive. That was
Mm.
the powerful incentive in my life, I suppose.
Nice. Before we wrap up, let's have a look at some of the ways in which maybe we've drifted from attachment theory and why that is. Why
Well,
do you?
let me grab that question and put it to you, because I think you may have thought about it more than me. I don't know, but I think your sort of initial associations was maybe a bit a bit more you really made a very big choice to train that way, right? And although I was associated with the Bowlby Centre, I didn't train there. You did, right? You did what, 4 or 5 years of that?
Yep. Yeah, I did. I think at that part of my,
you described yourself as an attachment-based therapist, and now you know, if people came and found your website, they would find that language on there, wouldn't they? Probably is acting as a keyword search, but you're also offering something else because you thought it was limited, or because it needs supplementing, or you're less sure of the evidence base, or how would you answer that question?
a mix of all of those things. So I think from a personal perspective, I went ideologically to that training thinking the nurture was 99% of the answer. I think now I'm increasingly thinking that nurture is 50% of the answer. Like, it's a complex interaction between predisposition genetically and the environment in which you find yourself. And I think the vast bulk of the contemporary evidence suggests that that is correct. I think mental health and personality and psychology are more complicated than one dimension, and attachment is an important dimension, a very important dimension, particularly in romantic relationships, but it's one dimension through which to approach personality and mental health more generally. On a more kind of slightly potentially boring way, the evidence suggests that your attachment style over time is not that reliable, right? That your attachment style with your parents is not necessarily directly linked to the attachment style that you will have with romantic partners later in life. And certain types of romantic partners will draw out a certain type of, or an intensity of, attachment style with you. And once you start getting into those kind of nuances, and when you get into the nuances of people like you and me, that I think we'd say over our lifetimes, we've had elements of a insecure, anxious, and an insecure avoidant style within us. You start getting to those kind of complexities. The whole kind of house of cards almost falls over at that point. You're like, what are we actually talking about here then? What are we talking about here in terms of what started as a theory, which is about the direct link between early childhood relationships and how you act with your partners when you're older? If we're talking in much more gray areas about people having a complex style on a spectrum, and it might get exacerbated by different romantic partners in different ways, then for me, it starts to lose its power, right? It starts to lose like a real direct lens through which to see, okay, if a parent does this, it's going to have this impact in future life. And I think that that's the reality of human psychology. Human psychology is complex. We're very, very complex people. There's a million different reasons why I am the person I am. Attachment is a part of that, and particularly in my romantic relationships, it gets exacerbated, but it is just one part of it. And I think that's why I've dropped the idea that I'm an attachment-based therapist. That was a long-winded way of answering the question.
No, it's good, and maybe that's our sign off. It prompted like two thoughts in me, if they're any use. One is that I think sometimes it can be spoken about in too precise a way. I think it gives you a headline, doesn't it?
I agree.
Gives you a sense of where someone's coming from. Like, I would still want to say something about your attachment style that would still be meaningful for me.
Yes.
If we're talking, I would offer that up to you, and I don't think we'd be wildly in disagreement about where I sort of saw that coming out, you know. And I think in headline terms, that could put us on the same page for this sort of conversation or a different one. And if we were working together clinically, I think it could be, you know, it could be useful for some people. It unlocks a door. The thing to say,
it also gives you something to do from there, though, as well, doesn't it? Crucially, it gives you something gives me an action plan. If you say, like, obviously you have some anxious elements, but you're primarily avoidant, so here's what we're going to do to help you, that's really useful.
Yeah, and I do think it shows up differently in those kind of situations, because we do feel differently in some situations. Like some people would continue to feel anxious when they're speaking in public if they don't do it very often. But if that is a part of your job for 2 or 3 times a week, your body can't stay adrenalized for that long. You'll start to be really good and really comfortable with that. So in some work situations, you know exactly what you're doing and you're super comfortable. And in some social situations, you are uncomfortable. So I'm sort of, I don't mean to reduce the sort of complexity of the point you're making, but really to build on it. Like, the circumstances we're in will determine how we feel about things. I think where it doesn't go right, the attachment theory, some people have made it more differentiated than the 3-4 buckets. You know, they've done, like, Pat Crittenden's work is like much more on a spectrum. It is much more of a complex statement. I think for me, in the end, that probably just didn't really chime, that we make it more and more precise and give it more and more precision. I think I sort of agree with your point that it's a headline, it's sometimes clinically useful, it's sometimes useful in conversations with people to think about that. I think it's kind of useful in mate selection, isn't it? You know, to think about what person you're drawn to, what you're bringing to the table, what the other person is bringing to the table, and to be kind of aware of those things. But I wouldn't necessarily say that we're trying to get people into, you know, particular definitions that would hold across multiple domains of life. That feels like sort of, I don't know, faux science, a bit of folly, really.
Everything in modern science seems to point towards spectrums, right? So the big 5 personality elements we've talked about, neurodivergence, it seems to be based on a spectrum of traits. I think attachment, similarly, it's a helpful spectrum to think that there's avoidant at one end, anxious at the other, and secure in the middle, and we kind of ebb and flow through that spectrum, but broadly we locate ourselves in one part of that spectrum. I think that's a helpful way of seeing romantic relationships. And once you start getting into, well, there's 10 different styles and 10 different boxes or 20 different boxes, that, again, for me, the whole thing starts to become pointless almost at that stage.
Yeah, good. All right, that'll do us, won't it?
I think that'll do us. Good to see you.
Nice to see you, Graham.
If anyone wants to contact us, we're at Crazy in Love podcast UK @gmail.com, and we'll see you soon. Take care.